Picture this: a darkened harbor somewhere in the South China Sea. No lights, no radio chatter, just the gentle lapping of waves against a hull that officially doesn't exist. On the deck, men in unmarked uniforms load crates that bear no insignia, no serial numbers, nothing that could trace them back to Washington. The captain checks his watch. Midnight. Time to disappear into international waters. This is the story most Americans have never heard. The story of how the United States Navy became the invisible hand behind some of the CIA's most daring and dangerous operations. From the beaches of Cuba to the rivers of Vietnam, from the icy waters off the Soviet coast to secret installations in the Pacific, Navy sailors and intelligence operatives worked in the shadows, conducting missions that would never appear in official records. This is the untold history of the CIA's Maritime Branch, where the line between military service and espionage blurred into something entirely new. Where young sailors found themselves not just serving their country, but redefining what that service meant. And where the Navy itself transformed from a traditional fighting force into something far more complex, far more secretive, and far more essential to America's Cold War survival. Let's go back to where it all began. The year is 1947. World War II has been over for just 2 years, but already a new kind of war is emerging. The Soviet Union, once an ally, now looms as an existential threat. President Harry Truman signs the National Security Act, creating the Central Intelligence Agency. But here's what most people don't understand. The CIA didn't just need analysts sitting in offices in Washington. It needed operators. It needed people who could move in the shadows, who understood the sea, who could navigate dangerous waters both literally and figuratively. And it needed the Navy. The Navy had something the brand new CIA desperately needed. It had ships. It had sailors who understood maritime operations. It had decades, even centuries, of experience operating in every ocean on Earth. But most importantly, it had legitimacy. A Navy ship could be almost anywhere in the world, and no one would question it. Naval vessels patrolled international waters. They conducted exercises. They showed the flag. It was all perfectly normal, perfectly legal, perfectly unremarkable. Unless, of course, that ship was doing something else entirely. The CIA's Maritime Branch didn't appear overnight. It evolved gradually, quietly, as the intelligence agency figured out what it needed. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the relationship between the CIA and Navy was informal, almost improvisational. An intelligence officer would approach a Navy captain with a special request. Could you take this team to these coordinates? Could you pick up a package from this location? Could you just happen to be near this port when something important is happening? Most of the time, the Navy said yes. Not because they had to, but because they understood the stakes. The Cold War wasn't going to be won with battleships alone. It required intelligence, cunning, and the ability to operate in the gray spaces where conventional military force couldn't go. By the mid-1950s, what had been informal cooperation became something more structured. The CIA established dedicated maritime units, staffed partly by active-duty Navy personnel on special assignment and partly by CIA officers who had naval backgrounds. These units operated what became known as proprietary vessels, ships that looked like ordinary commercial or fishing vessels, but were actually owned and operated by CIA front companies. The sailors who crewed these ships were a unique breed. Some were Navy veterans who had been recruited into the CIA. Others were active-duty sailors on classified assignments they could never discuss. Still others were contract employees, civilians with maritime experience who found themselves drawn into the shadowy world of intelligence operations. The work was unlike anything in conventional Navy service. These sailors didn't wear uniforms most of the time. They carried false identification. They learned cover stories and maintained them even under pressure. A man might spend months posing as a merchant marine, hauling cargo between Asian ports, while secretly photographing Soviet naval installations or dropping off intelligence operatives on hostile shores. The psychological toll was immense. These men couldn't tell their families what they really did. They couldn't share their experiences with fellow veterans. They carried secrets that isolated them, that separated them from the normal world of military service. Let's talk about Cuba, because that's where the Maritime Branch really proved its worth and faced some of its greatest challenges. After Fidel Castro took power in 1959, Cuba became an obsession for American policymakers. Just 90 miles from Florida, the island had transformed from a friendly dictatorship into a communist state aligned with Moscow. The CIA immediately began planning operations to destabilize Castro's regime, and many of those operations required maritime support. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 is well known, but what's less understood is the Navy's role in that disaster. CIA maritime units, supported by Navy assets, transported the Cuban exile brigade to the invasion beaches. Navy ships stood offshore, ready to provide support. Navy pilots flew reconnaissance missions. When the invasion collapsed into chaos, it was Navy vessels that rescued survivors from the beaches. The failure of the Bay of Pigs didn't end maritime operations against Cuba. If anything, it intensified them. Under Operation Mongoose, authorized by President Kennedy himself, the CIA launched a campaign of sabotage, infiltration, and intelligence gathering against Castro's government. And the Maritime Branch was at the center of it all. Fast boats, many of them based in Florida, would race across the Straits of Florida under cover of darkness. They carried teams of Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA, men determined to overthrow Castro or die trying. These boats would slip into Cuban waters, drop off sabotage teams, pick up intelligence assets, or conduct hit-and-run raids on coastal installations. The missions were incredibly dangerous. Cuban patrol boats hunted them. Coastal radar tracked them. Castro's forces were on high alert, knowing the Americans wouldn't give up. Many operatives never came back. Some were captured, facing torture and execution. Others simply disappeared, lost at sea or killed in firefights that were never officially acknowledged. The Navy personnel involved in these operations lived double lives. By day, they might be at a regular naval station performing ordinary duties. By night, they were running covert missions that violated every principle of conventional warfare. There were no rules of engagement in the traditional sense. No uniforms to protect them if captured. No official recognition if they were killed. These men operated in a legal and moral gray zone, doing work their country needed but could never publicly acknowledge. The stress was enormous. Relationships suffered. Some men turned to alcohol. Others simply broke under the pressure. But they kept going because they believed in the mission, because they trusted their teammates, and because they understood that the freedom they were defending sometimes required actions that couldn't be discussed in the light of day. Now let's shift our focus to Southeast Asia, because that's where maritime branch operations reached their peak of complexity and danger. When America began its deepening involvement in Vietnam in the early 1960s, the CIA was already there, and so was its maritime capability. The coastline of Vietnam, the rivers that cut through the jungle, the border areas with Laos and Cambodia, all of these became operational areas for CIA maritime units supported by Navy personnel and assets. One of the lesser-known aspects of the Vietnam War was the extensive CIA operation to run agents into North Vietnam. These weren't the conventional military operations you've seen in movies. These were intelligence missions designed to gather information, conduct sabotage, and support resistance movements behind enemy lines. Many of these insertion operations were maritime. Fast boats would leave from bases in South Vietnam or Thailand, racing north under cover of darkness. They navigated treacherous waters, avoiding North Vietnamese patrol boats and coastal defenses. The teams they inserted often never returned. The North Vietnamese security apparatus was brutal and efficient. But the missions continued because the intelligence was considered vital. The Navy's role went far beyond just providing boats. Naval intelligence officers worked closely with CIA counterparts to analyze shipping patterns, identify targets, and plan operations. Navy SEALs, though technically a military special operations force, frequently worked on missions that blurred the line between military action and intelligence operations. These SEALs would conduct reconnaissance of enemy positions, snatch operations to capture enemy personnel for interrogation, and direct action missions against high-value targets. The coordination between the Navy and CIA became so seamless that it was often impossible to tell where one organization ended and the other began. There were also the river operations, particularly in the Mekong Delta. The CIA ran extensive operations in this vast network of waterways, using everything from small sampans to modified patrol boats. The goal was to interdict Viet Cong supply lines, gather intelligence on enemy movements, and support friendly forces in one of the most challenging operational environments imaginable. Navy personnel, both active duty and those on assignment to the CIA, became experts in riverine warfare. They learned to navigate by the stars, to read the subtle signs of enemy presence, to distinguish between friendly villagers and Viet Cong operatives. This knowledge, purchased with blood and hard experience, would later inform the Navy's development of its riverine warfare capabilities. But Vietnam wasn't the only theater where maritime branch operations mattered. All across the Pacific, CIA maritime units conducted operations that remain classified to this day. There were missions along the Chinese coast, gathering intelligence on China's growing military capabilities. There were operations in Indonesia during that country's political upheavals in the mid-1960s. There were monitoring missions near Soviet naval bases in the Pacific, tracking submarine movements and testing Soviet defenses. Every one of these operations carried enormous risk. Discovery could mean a diplomatic crisis or worse. Failure could mean death. But the intelligence gathered was considered essential to understanding and countering communist expansion in Asia. Let's talk about the technology for a moment, because the Maritime Branch wasn't just about brave men in boats. It was also about innovation and adaptation. The CIA invested heavily in developing specialized vessels for covert operations. Some of these looked like ordinary fishing boats but had reinforced hulls, powerful engines, and hidden compartments for weapons and equipment. Others were designed for specific missions, fast insertion craft that could outrun enemy patrol boats, or slow, silent vessels that could approach a coast without being detected. The Navy contributed its technical expertise, helping design and build these craft. Naval engineers worked on propulsion systems that were quieter, navigation systems that were more accurate, and communication systems that were more secure. One innovation that deserves mention is the development of swimmer delivery vehicles and diving systems. The CIA needed ways to insert operatives underwater, either to avoid detection or to reach targets that couldn't be approached by surface craft. Navy divers and submariners contributed their expertise to developing these capabilities. The result was a suite of technologies that allowed intelligence operatives to approach enemy installations from beneath the surface, plant listening devices or explosives, and escape without being detected. These techniques, pioneered in CIA operations, eventually became standard capabilities for Navy Special Operations Forces. There was also the intelligence collection apparatus itself. Ships operating under Maritime Branch auspices were often equipped with sophisticated electronic intelligence gathering equipment. They could intercept radio communications, track radar emissions, and even collect signals intelligence from satellites and other sources. To any observer, these vessels looked like ordinary cargo ships or research vessels. But hidden behind false bulkheads were antenna arrays, recording equipment, and analysis stations where intelligence officers processed the data in real time. The Navy's expertise in naval communications and electronics was essential to these operations. Many of the operators were Navy enlisted personnel, communications technicians, and electronic warfare specialists, who found themselves doing intelligence work that went far beyond their original training. Now we need to address something that often gets overlooked when people discuss covert operations: the human cost. We're not just talking about the men who were killed or captured, though those losses were real and devastating. We're talking about the psychological and moral burden carried by everyone involved in these operations. Imagine being a young sailor, maybe 22 or 23 years old. You join the Navy to serve your country, maybe to see the world, maybe to learn a trade. Suddenly you find yourself on a mission that isn't in any manual, doing things that aren't in any training course. You're dropping off men on a hostile beach, knowing that many of them will likely be killed. You're conducting surveillance on targets, gathering information that will be used to plan raids or assassinations. You can't talk about it, not to your family, not to your friends, not even to other sailors. The isolation is crushing. Many of these men struggled when they returned to normal Navy duty or civilian life. They had experiences that set them apart, that they couldn't share. Some developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in that era it wasn't well understood or treated. Relationships failed. Careers stalled. Some men self-medicated with alcohol or drugs. The Navy and CIA weren't equipped to provide the kind of mental health support these operators needed. It was only decades later, as some of these operations were declassified, that the full scope of the psychological burden became clear. Veterans of Maritime Branch operations began to connect with each other, to share their experiences, and to help each other heal. But that healing came late, often too late for the men who had suffered in silence for years. There's also the moral dimension. These operations existed in an ethical gray zone. The CIA and Navy weren't operating under the traditional laws of war. The men they inserted often conducted sabotage and attacks against targets in countries with which the United States was not officially at war. The line between legitimate intelligence operations and acts that might be considered terrorism, depending on your perspective, was often blurry. The operators themselves sometimes struggled with these questions. Was what they were doing right? Was it necessary? Was it effective? These aren't easy questions, and the answers depend on your political perspective, your ethical framework, and your understanding of the Cold War context. What's important to understand is that the men involved weren't mindless automatons. They thought about these issues, they wrestled with them, and they made their choices for better or worse. Let's turn our attention to another critical area of maritime branch operations, the surveillance and monitoring of Soviet naval activities. Throughout the Cold War, understanding Soviet naval capabilities was a top priority for American intelligence. The Soviet Union had a massive submarine fleet, including nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines that could strike American cities with little warning. They had a growing surface fleet that challenged American naval dominance. And they had naval bases and facilities scattered across the globe, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The CIA and Navy worked together to monitor all of it. Some of this monitoring was done by submarines, operating in what the Navy called special operations. These submarines would slip into Soviet territorial waters, sometimes hugging the coastline, to photograph installations, tap underwater communication cables, or track Soviet submarine movements. These missions were incredibly dangerous. If a submarine was detected in Soviet waters, it could trigger an international incident or even a shooting war. The crews were hand-picked, the captains among the Navy's best. They operated in complete silence, sometimes for weeks at a time, knowing that one mistake could mean disaster. The intelligence they gathered was invaluable, providing insights into Soviet naval capabilities that couldn't be obtained any other way. Surface vessels also played a role. Ships that appeared to be conducting oceanographic research or fishing operations would actually be intelligence collection platforms. They would position themselves near Soviet naval exercise areas or along submarine transit routes. Their sensors would record everything: acoustic signatures, radio communications, radar emissions. This data would be analyzed to understand Soviet tactics, capabilities, and intentions. The Soviet Navy knew this was happening and would often harass these vessels, sailing close, shining spotlights, even occasionally bumping into them. The American crews had to maintain their cover stories while also standing their ground. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse played out on the high seas. There were also more direct action operations. On several occasions, the CIA and Navy cooperated in efforts to recover Soviet military equipment that had been lost at sea. The most famous of these was Project Azorian in the 1970s, the attempt to raise a sunken Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. That operation, though technically beyond our main time frame, grew directly out of the maritime intelligence cooperation that had been established in the 50s and 60s. The capability to conduct such an audacious operation existed because the CIA and Navy had spent years developing the technology, the expertise, and the operational methods needed for deep ocean intelligence work. One aspect of Soviet monitoring that deserves special attention is the Arctic operations. The Arctic Ocean, particularly the waters north of Russia, was a critical operational area for Soviet submarines. Nuclear ballistic missile submarines would patrol under the ice, nearly undetectable, ready to launch their weapons if war came. The CIA and Navy desperately needed to understand Soviet activities in this region. Submarines would conduct dangerous under-ice operations, surfacing through gaps in the ice pack to deploy sensors or conduct reconnaissance. Surface vessels, specially reinforced for Arctic operations, would venture into these hostile waters, often in total darkness during the winter months, to gather intelligence. The men who served on these missions faced not just the danger from Soviet forces, but the brutal environment itself. Equipment would freeze. Men could die from exposure in minutes if they fell into the water. But the missions continued because the intelligence was considered vital to national security. The relationship between the CIA and Navy wasn't always smooth. There were bureaucratic tensions, disagreements over mission priorities, and conflicts over resources. The Navy was a traditional military service with a clear chain of command and established procedures. The CIA was a civilian intelligence agency that operated with more flexibility, but also less accountability. When you brought these two cultures together, friction was inevitable. Navy officers sometimes chafed at what they saw as the CIA's cowboy mentality, the willingness to take risks that seemed excessive. CIA officers sometimes viewed the Navy as too rigid, too bound by regulations and traditions. But despite these tensions, the partnership worked. Why? Because the people involved on both sides understood that they were part of something larger than their own agencies. They were defending their country in a new kind of war, one that required new kinds of cooperation. Let's talk about the bases and facilities that supported maritime branch operations. These weren't the big, well-known naval bases like Norfolk or San Diego. They were often small, quiet facilities, sometimes disguised as commercial operations. In the Pacific, there were bases in Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan. In the Atlantic, facilities in Puerto Rico and other Caribbean locations supported Cuban operations. In Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, there were bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. These facilities often looked unremarkable. A few buildings, some docks, maybe a warehouse. But inside, sophisticated operations were planned and launched. The personnel at these bases lived double lives. They might have official cover as embassy staff, military advisors, or civilian contractors. But their real job was supporting intelligence operations. The security at these facilities was intense. Only personnel with the proper clearances could enter. Information was compartmented, meaning that even people working at the same base might not know what their colleagues were doing. Communications were encrypted and carefully controlled. Visitors were rare and closely monitored. The people who worked at these facilities understood that secrecy wasn't just a bureaucratic requirement. It was essential to the success of operations and the safety of operators in the field. One leak, one careless conversation, could compromise a mission and cost lives. Now I want to spend some time on the aftermath, the legacy of these operations. As the Cold War wound down in the late 80s and early 90s, many maritime branch operations were scaled back or ended. Some of the proprietary vessels were sold off or scrapped. Personnel returned to conventional Navy duties or retired. Facilities were closed or repurposed. But the impact of these operations continued to resonate. The techniques developed for covert maritime operations became part of the Navy's Special Operations Toolkit. The SEAL teams that had worked so closely with the CIA became more capable and sophisticated. The intelligence relationships that had been forged remained strong, enabling new forms of cooperation in later conflicts. When some of these operations began to be declassified in the decades that followed, the public got its first real glimpse of what had been going on. Books were written, documentaries were made. Veterans finally had the opportunity to tell their stories. And what emerged was a complex picture. There were successes, operations that had gathered vital intelligence or disrupted enemy activities. There were failures, missions that had gone wrong, lives lost for little gain. There were moral questions about the nature of covert action and the limits of what a democracy should do in the name of national security. These debates continue today. What's clear looking back is that the CIA's maritime branch operations represented a fundamental evolution in how America used naval power. For centuries, navies had been about controlling the seas through force. Battleships, cruisers, and carriers projected power openly. But the maritime branch operations showed that naval power could also be about stealth, deception, and intelligence. A small boat operated by a handful of skilled personnel could sometimes achieve what an entire battle group could not. This insight has shaped modern naval special operations. Today's Navy has extensive capabilities for covert action, from SEAL teams to special operations craft to submarines equipped for special missions. These capabilities exist because of the lessons learned during the Cold War, when the CIA and Navy figured out how to work together in the shadows. There's also a broader lesson about the nature of military service. The sailors who participated in maritime branch operations weren't the traditional image of the American serviceman. They didn't march in parades. They didn't wear their uniforms with pride in public. They couldn't tell their families what they did. But they served just as truly, just as bravely, as any conventional warrior. They took risks that most of us can barely imagine. They carried burdens that left scars long after their service ended. And they did it because they believed it was necessary, because they trusted in their mission, and because they were committed to defending their country in whatever way was needed. As we reflect on this history, it's worth asking what it tells us about American power and American values. The maritime branch operations were, in many ways, the antithesis of transparency and democratic accountability. They were secret by design. They operated outside normal legal and military frameworks. The American people weren't asked to approve them, and mostly didn't know they existed. Yet they were undertaken by a democratic government, authorized at the highest levels, in pursuit of objectives that leadership believed served the national interest. This tension between security and transparency, between effectiveness and accountability, runs through the entire history of American intelligence operations. It's a tension that hasn't been resolved and probably can't be fully resolved. Different people with different political perspectives and different values will come to different conclusions about whether these operations were justified. What's important is that we understand the history. We need to know what was done in our name, even when it was kept secret. We need to understand the costs, both human and moral. We need to appreciate the courage of the men who served, while also being willing to ask hard questions about the missions they were given. This kind of historical reckoning isn't about assigning blame or celebrating uncritically. It's about understanding the full complexity of how America fought the Cold War, with all its successes and failures, its moral certainties, and its gray areas. The men who served in Maritime Branch operations were part of a unique moment in history. They were present at the creation of modern intelligence operations. They helped figure out how a democracy could fight in the shadows while maintaining its values, or at least trying to. They faced challenges that had no easy answers and made choices that carried enormous consequences. Some of them are still with us, though they're growing old now. Most of them still can't talk about everything they did. Some of what they experienced remains classified even today, decades later. But their story is part of American history, part of Navy history, and part of the larger story of the Cold War. As we close, I want to return to that image we started with. The darkened harbor, the unmarked ship, the men loading crates in silence. Now you understand what that image represents. It represents a kind of service that doesn't fit neat categories. It represents the complicated relationship between intelligence and military power. It represents the courage of ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things in circumstances where failure could mean disaster. The CIA's Maritime Branch operations, supported by the United States Navy, were never the largest or most visible part of America's Cold War effort. But they were essential. They gathered intelligence that informed policy decisions. They conducted operations that disrupted enemy plans. They demonstrated American reach and capability in ways that kept adversaries off balance. And they were carried out by sailors who signed up to serve their country and ended up serving in ways they never imagined. This history matters not just as a tale from the past, but as a guide for understanding the present. Today, the United States faces new threats that require intelligence, cunning, and the ability to operate in gray zones. The lessons learned from Maritime Branch operations, both the successes and the failures, inform how America approaches these challenges. The capabilities developed during those Cold War years have evolved and expanded. The cooperation between intelligence and military forces has become even more seamless. But the fundamental questions remain the same. How does a democracy conduct covert operations? How do we balance security and transparency? How do we support the people we ask to serve in the shadows? These are questions every generation must answer for itself. The sailors who crewed those unmarked boats, who ran those dangerous missions, who kept secrets that isolated them from everyone they loved, they were patriots in the truest sense. They put service before self. They accepted danger and hardship without complaint. They did what their country asked of them, even when that meant operating outside the normal rules, even when that meant carrying burdens they couldn't share. Their story is a reminder that military service takes many forms. Sometimes it's about courage under fire in open combat. Sometimes it's about patience and skill in the shadows, conducting operations that can never be acknowledged. Both forms of service are essential. Both require dedication and sacrifice, and both deserve our respect and gratitude. As this history continues to be revealed through declassification and the memoirs of those involved, we're gaining a fuller picture of how America fought the Cold War. The CIA's Maritime Branch operations were one piece of a vast, complex effort that spanned decades and involved thousands of people. They weren't always successful. They sometimes raised serious ethical questions. But they were part of how America defended itself and its interests during an existential struggle. Understanding this history doesn't mean we have to approve of every operation or every decision. It means we acknowledge the full complexity of that struggle and honor the men who fought it, in all the many ways that fighting took place. The next time you see a Navy ship on patrol, or read about special operations, or hear about intelligence gathering, remember that there's often more to the story than what's visible on the surface. Remember that there are men and women serving today in ways they can't discuss, in places they can't reveal, carrying out missions that won't be acknowledged for years or decades. They're the inheritors of the tradition established by those maritime branch operators in the 1950s and 60s. They're continuing a form of service that's essential but often invisible, and they deserve the same recognition, the same respect, and the same support that we give to any American in uniform. The story of the CIA's maritime branch operations and the Navy's covert support from Cuba to Southeast Asia is a story of shadows and secrets. But it's also a story of service, sacrifice, and the complicated reality of defending freedom in a dangerous world. It's a story that needed to be told, and now it's a story you'll carry forward, understanding just a little bit more about the hidden history of American military and intelligence operations during the Cold War.